following their small local victory at the Battle of Neath Lille. The men and tanks of the Royal Bedfordshire Yeomanry, RBY, were pulled off the line, withdrawn and sent 22 miles back to a depot in the rear. They had been at the front line fighting every single day for the past 13 days, since the enemy's main offensive had begun. But attrition had begun to really take its toll. The regiment pulled up into the line with 52 tanks crewed by 268 officers and other ranks. By the time the regiment was pulled off the line and reached the depot in the rear, they were down to 33 serviceable tanks crewed by 195 officers and men still fit for duty. The tankmen had suffered 73 casualties, 20 killed in action, and 53 men wounded needing hospitalisation. Actually, there were plenty more wounded men, however, most of these, after slapping on a quick bandage or field dressing, were able to return to duty. Further to this, the regiment's A and B echelons, which actually made up the majority of manpower within the regiment, these being the mechanics, armourers, fitters, drivers, service corps personnel essential for keeping the tanks equipped, supplied and ready to fight, had also suffered casualties. 7 men killed, 8 wounded, when Stuka dive bombers had bombed one of their convoys, destroying a fuel truck as well as an ammo truck and damaging 3 other vehicles. But it was at the depot that the men of the RBY were to come in with a bit of a shock. Here, the men were ordered to hand over their tanks to the men of the 4th Royal Tank Regiment, or 4RTR. This regiment actually consisted of the survivors of both 4RTR and 7RTR following their attacks in the Arras area. Attacks that had begun well before running headlong into a wall of 88mm guns. Basically, the men of the RBY were swapping tanks with the men of the 4th Royal Tank Regiment. They had 13 Matilda 1s and 8 Matilda 2s still serviceable, the only survivors in fact from the 2 tank regiments. But the 4th RTR was now being put into a new composite armoured division, and it was due to attack the very next day, engaging enemy armour. And for a job like that, machine gun armed Matilda 1s would not do. They needed tanks with guns. Naturally, the men of the RBY were furious. One tank driver recorded in his diary, "It was bloody outrageous. Fucking betrayal. Why couldn't we just do their job at the end of the day? We were better than them. They'd been in one action, one single battle, and it had cost them almost every tank they had. We had been in action for 2 weeks, and we still had the best part of our regiment remaining, tanks and all. What was the use of swapping us with our cruiser tanks with them with their Matildas? Why can't we just become part of this new armoured division and carry out their task for them? It made much more sense." But at this time in the war, the British Army was still plagued by regimental rivalries. The Royal Tank Regiment men were, after all, the professionals of the army. The vast majority of the men in the RBY were weekend warriors, part-timers, part of the territorial army that had stood up to become a full-time regiment for the duration of the war. And even though they had already accrued a great deal more experience, especially in tank-on-tank engagements, than the men of the Royal Tank Regiment, this did not matter to those at the top. They had a complete misunderstanding of the situation. Regimental Sergeant Major Christopher Mears of the RBY remembers, "It were sad, quite sad. Of course the men were angry, I don't blame them. Seeing these smiling, grinning RTR lads climbing aboard their tanks, getting in the turrets, making themselves comfortable. And you know, the men got attached to their tanks, and this was something that we encouraged. At the end of the day, the more attached to the tanks they were, the more they tried to look after them, and the more efficient they fought. And some of these tanks that we were handing over had had our lads killed in them. Commanders had been shot dead while standing in their cupolas, and so naturally the entire regiment was pissed off. And to make matters worse, the entire regiment would need reorganizing very quickly, because the next day they were to support the Armoured Division attack, providing flanking protection to the 4th RTR as they went into their own attack. The RBY's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Tom Beddoe, remembers, "Of course, with the regiment now being down to less than half strength in tank numbers, and most of those tanks being those little 2 crewman affairs, we had a lot of men just twiddling their thumbs. In fact, we had 129 men, including myself and my 2IC, who did not have a tank. And on top of that, we had taken command of 53 infantrymen from the 4th Royal Durham Light Infantry, who were the last remainders of their own unit. Their entire battalion had been wiped out. These men came from the headquarters company and were mostly mortarmen and support weapons specialists. And so I made a decision. All of us that did not have tanks would go off into the depot and find infantry weapons. Rifles, Bren guns, grenades, boys anti-tank rifles, anything of the sort, and we'd reorganize into a mixed tank and dismounted regiment. And indeed, this is exactly what happened. The men of the RBY were further incensed by this. They were tank men after all, not infantrymen. But they went ahead with it on the promise that they would soon be re-equipped with tanks. And so with the infantry reinforcements, there were enough men and weapons to make 6 ad hoc platoon-sized groups that the men still insisted on calling troops. After all, they were a tank regiment. And so as the regiment advanced towards the town of Saint-Mère-Chappelle on the flank of the 4th RTR attack, it was organised like so. Each of the 3 squadrons, normally armed with 16 tanks each, now had at least 2 troops of tanks. A squadron was armed with 7 Matilda 1s, organised into 2 troops. B squadron had 6 Matilda 1s, also organised into 2 troops. Whereas C squadron, Lucky C as they became known, had 8 Matilda 2s, organised into 2 troops. Additionally, each squadron also had 2 troops, that is platoon-sized groups, of dismounted men fighting on foot. B squadron led the advance into the town of Saint-Mère-Chappelle. This was the regiment's primary objective, and as they pushed in, they came under fire from a German field gun. Of course, the men had been under artillery fire before, even shot at plenty of times, but usually they had their tank's armour between them and the danger, and when they didn't, when they had been forced to bail out, they never had to move towards those enemy weapons. Normally they ran back to their headquarters. Now, however, they had to push on towards the enemy guns, and be prepared to take it at the bayonet point if necessary. 2 section from 7 Troop now pushed up to a building which separated them from the gun had been keeping them under fire, and here one of the former infantrymen of the Durham Light Infantry jumped up with his Bren gun in hand and charged around the corner of the building, as Lieutenant Spellers remembers. This lad in my troop just jumped up and ran for it. Everyone shouted, "Where are you going?" He ran around the corner, out of cover, and just started spraying into this enemy gun crew, knocking them all down like pins. We all thought it was actually quite impressive, and I feel that it may have actually instilled some confidence in us. Enemy support gun now destroyed, the men of B squadron could move up and push on towards their objective, one of which was a junction in the main road running through the town. Basically, the whole idea was to stop enemy reinforcements moving from west through to the east to where 4 RTR were engaging the main enemy line. The town of Saint-Mère-Chappelle would be a very useful road junction to whomever held it, and whilst B squadron were making their assault on the town, it was thinly held by German screening troops. Major Matthew Jupp, officer commanding B squadron, now ordered 5 Troop in their 3 Matilda tanks and 7 Troop, dismounted, to push up towards their objective, the crossroads. Some men from 7 Troop were ordered to take command of the field gun they had just captured from the Germans and turn it on their original owners. With the tank men having had great deal of use with guns, having them take command and use this weapon was not too far a stretch, and it would indeed come in very handy for the rest of the battle. The slow, lumbering Matilda 1s made their way towards their objective at last, as the dismounted men pinned down the German defenders on the objective. One of the 3 Matilda 1s, instead of being armed with a 303 Vickers machine gun, was armed with a .5-inch Vickers machine gun, the heavier gun, and this also came in very useful for pinning down enemy troops. At last, the tanks of 5 Troop, together with the dismounted men of 7 Troop, now made a determined push towards the road junction, which was their primary objective. However, as they did so, an anti-tank gun hidden amongst the rubble shot through a gap in the wall, striking the tank commanded by Lieutenant Richard Jolly, the 5th Troop commander. The first 2 or 3 rounds struck the tank and didn't cause any damage, until at last one penetrated through the turret ring, killing Lieutenant Jolly. His driver remembers, "There were several loud bangs until at last something wet splashed down my back. Turning behind me, I saw a pair of severed legs, cut above the knee, and Lieutenant Jolly sliding down a turret into the main body of the tank. He was bleeding terribly. I didn't know a man could bleed so fast. He faded very quickly. Less than a minute, I'd say. I panicked. I jumped up out of my hatch and hid in a nearby shell crater. After all, I was in the line of fire, there's not much I could do. Poor old Lieutenant Jolly, however. He was only 21 years old." Despite this unfortunate loss, the other 2 tanks of the troop pushed up, and the infantry moved on to capture their positions around the junction. For the rest of the battle now, they would have a standoff with this anti-tank gun and the supporting infantry on the other side of the ruined buildings across the street. Neither side had the power to assault the other. But now that half of B Squadron were in position to block one of the main roads through the town, 6th Troop and 8th Troop would now push north and take their own objective in a park area covering other roads through the town. Their progress was largely unopposed. That is until 3 section of number 8 Troop suffered casualties from a nearby mortar blast. The men had been taken by surprise by this nearby weapon, and those who survived the blast jumped up and rushed it, opening fire and bringing down the crew. Medics were called for to deal with the wounded, and the force pushed on towards their objective. There was a great deal of close quarter fighting in and around the town. Enemy rat runs meant that German troops kept propping up behind the advancing forces, and men had to be detached to deal with them. Tanks fighting in built up areas had to take it very slow and very carefully. Kind of ideal for the Matilda 1s with their 6 miles per hour top speed. And as it happens, the dismounted tankmen made for good infantry support for the tanks, knowing exactly what they required. Nevertheless, it was important that the tanks advanced slowly and carefully. Every corner could hide an anti-tank weapon, or even an infantryman with a Molotov cocktail or satchel charge ready to launch at the tank. Meanwhile, back at the road junction, number 5 Troop and number 7 Troop were heavily engaged with the enemy still, as small German counterattacks attempted to dislodge them from their position. And unfortunately, all but 1 man from one of the sections were killed when a German mortar round slammed to the ground right in amongst their position. Back with number 6 Troop, the leading tank had been immobilized, its track had been thrown. This had been caused by a bundle stick grenade being thrown under the tank's track. A rudimentary but rather effective way of dislodging tank tracks. The man who'd thrown the grenades, however, was killed in a hail of machine gun fire. But this of course held up the small force heading north towards their objective. A necessary pause whilst the tank track was repaired and ready for the tank to move off once again. It was not safe to leave the tank sitting out in the open without support, so the other parts of the force had to remain to give it protection. Again, back with 5 and 7 Troop, the men there were coming under more determined attacks. German light armoured vehicles from a reconnaissance battalion were now pushing up the road, moving to reinforce their own comrades fighting the main tank battle nearby. And here it was with 5 Troop, the captured German assault gun came to be very useful indeed. And with the 7 Troop tank track now repaired, the northern force pushed on. They were now closing in on their objective, and Lieutenant Michael Kearney, commander of 6 Troop, took his tank forwards to scout out the main enemy position to see how well defended it was. Here his tank was met by withering fire from the defenders around the point, and this fire grew in intensity as the rest of his tanks and his infantry pulled up and prepared to launch an assault. He now called in this tank regiment's secret weapon, support from 4 3-inch mortars. The infantrymen that had been attached to their regiment had indeed brought their mortars with them, and a mortar fire mission was brought down on the enemy defenders with great effect. Lieutenant Colonel Beddoe was very happy with this support. I'm fairly certain that I was the only chap in command of a tank regiment that had its own integrated 3-inch mortar support. And what's better, those mortarmen were out for revenge for what had been done to their original battalion. As 3-inch mortar bombs rained in around the main enemy positions, the tankmen moved up, ready to launch the final assault. Some German infantrymen now came out of their hiding places, trying to get in behind the tankmen, but tank Bravo 22, bringing up the rear, turned 90 degrees, reversed its gun, and began raking fire as the German infantry attempted to cross the street towards their enemy positions. Those who were not hit were scattered. And with that, B Squadron had secured the regiment's objectives in the town of Saint-Mère-Chapelle. All that remained was to continue beating off any attempts by the enemy to push through their positions and link up with their comrades further to the east. And with the Matilda IIs of C Squadron being held back in reserve, the regiment was confident that this they could do without too much trouble. The regiment had suffered 9 additional men killed and 5 more wounded, but they had again achieved their objectives and were now ready for the next phase of the operation.